Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into a topic that's equal parts scandalous and scholarly, the intimate, confusing, and sometimes downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was a time of chivalry and deeply questionable herbal remedies. An age when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one was watching. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy the content I create. And drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to see our little global community come together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's journey. Misconception number 1, medieval intimacy was romantic. You might imagine medieval sex happening beneath silk sheets, candlelight flickering, with a lute softly playing in the background. Reality check. Most people lived in small, one-room homes, shared with the entire family, including kids, elderly relatives, a couple of goats, and maybe a chicken with boundary issues. Privacy. Basically non-existent. If a couple wanted alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered. Volume definitely mattered. And ideally, the kids were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury. Beds were shared. Even among the nobility, you might have a servant sleeping at the foot of the bed or standing in the corner, awkwardly pretending not to notice anything. Noble households often kept written records of sleeping arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. Travel wasn't any better on the road. Things didn't improve. Inns often had shared beds, meaning you could end up spooning with a total stranger for the night. Looking for a little affection? Better check if the bed's already occupied, and whether your bedmate came with muddy boots. If you were married, awake, and moderately clean, you could hope for a little quiet intimacy on a straw mattress. If you weren't married, you had to be quiet and cautious. Small villages, thin walls, and gossip that spread faster than plague rats didn't make things easy. Monasteries and high garden walls for those living in monasteries or convents. The rules were simple: no privacy. No distractions. Definitely no late-night whispering. But even in religious life, human nature finds a way, which might explain the suspiciously high garden walls at many abbeys. The church. An authority in the bedroom, too. No institution shaped medieval intimacy more than the church. And they had plenty to say about what happened behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind a shared curtain. According to church doctrine, sex had one legitimate purpose: procreation. Not pleasure. Not love. Not stress relief. Just baby making. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed guidelines on what was acceptable. Certain days were off limits. So were feast days, fast days, holy days. And, depending on the region, entire liturgical seasons. Want to get close during Lent? Nope. Advent? Still no. Basically, you had Tuesdays in April. Even in marriage, the expectations were strict. Couples were encouraged to be modest and restrained. Affection was tolerated, but passion? That was pushing it. One 13th century manual advised married couples to engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which, frankly, sounds like the least fun to-do list ever written. Missionary position was preferred, not just for symbolic reasons, but because it was considered the most natural, and therefore the least offensive to God, the saints, and your local priest. Confession time, the awkward questions. Confession wasn't just for sins of the soul, it was also a place for very specific questions about what happened in people's beds. Priests weren't vague. They asked pointed, often uncomfortable questions to find out whether couples had strayed from moral guidelines. Let's just say your average 14th century friar probably knew more about his parishioners' sex lives than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was inconsistent. Some priests ignored the rules entirely. Some regions were more relaxed. And many peasants? They just nodded, smiled, and did what they were going to do anyway, quietly. If you found this journey into medieval intimacy fascinating, or at least wildly unexpected, let me know in the comments. Got a weird historical question? Drop it below, maybe we'll explore it in the next episode. Until then, sleep tight. Just, maybe don't share your bed with a stranger and their muddy boots. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they came with their own complications. At first, these bathhouses were places for legitimate cleanliness and even socialization. Think of them as medieval spas, communal tubs, warm water, the occasional herbal oil. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, sometimes together. Depending on local customs and just how scandalous the town felt that year. But over time, the line between bathing and bawdiness blurred. Many bathhouses slowly evolved into semi-discreet rendezvous spots. You could technically go for a scrub and end up with a scandal. In some cities, they became so closely linked with illicit activity that moralists launched full-on smear campaigns. Bathhouses were accused of promoting sin, spreading disease, and being gateways to damnation, with the added inconvenience of pruned fingers. Eventually, some were shut down. Others were taken over by religious authorities and rebranded as more virtuous spaces, though likely with fewer warm towels. The medieval sensual experience. Even outside of bathhouses, medieval hygiene was, let's say, textured. Perfume existed, but it was more about masking than cleansing. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme were stuffed into clothes, hung in homes, or carried in little pomanders, basically medieval Febreze. Wealthier folks might sprinkle rosewater on their linens. Everyone else hoped the smell of turnips and wood smoke was strong enough to drown out anything more personal. And underwear? Not always a given. Linen undergarments were worn when available. But for many people, especially the lower classes, layering was more optional than essential. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in the same clothes they wore all day, and possibly the day before. And the one before that. But let's talk about the real romance. With hygiene questionable, privacy rare, and religious regulations overlapping like a medieval Venn diagram of abstinence. One might ask, how did romance even survive? Surprisingly, it did, just not in the modern sense. While marriages were mostly practical arrangements, love found ways to bloom in unexpected corners. A shared joke at the market. A quiet walk after Vespers. A letter penned in clumsy Latin, passed via a trusted sibling or an overly enthusiastic stable boy. Troubadours sang about unattainable love because, for many, love was unattainable, or at least highly inconvenient. And yet, affection did happen. Not every marriage was loveless. Some couples found companionship, warmth, even passion, though, hopefully not on a liturgical feast day. Others had secret romances that remained hidden from watchful eyes and even more watchful priests. In summary, medieval love was complicated to sum up medieval intimacy in one sentence. It was tender, transactional, rule-bound, deeply human, and occasionally interrupted by a goat. From forbidden feast days to improvised privacy and perfumed rosemary bundles. Love and lust in the Middle Ages had to fight for survival. And yet, they did. In field and forest, castle and cottage, behind barns and between the lines of confession, romance endured. Just don't believe everything you hear about chastity belts. Or that everyone was dirty, cold, and joyless. The truth is far messier, and far more interesting. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language that, depending on the context, could either be interpreted as devout friendship or something far more intimate. In convents, women forged deeply emotional relationships, sometimes spiritual, sometimes romantic, and occasionally both. The boundaries were fluid, and while church authorities might pretend not to notice, The truth was often tucked quietly between the lines of illuminated manuscripts. There were even known terms in medieval Latin for these relationships. Words like amicitia specialis, special friendship, or soror amica, beloved sister, allowed for emotional closeness without necessarily triggering a theological inquisition. But if things became too public, or too physical, local clergy might intervene, usually with a stern lecture and a new set of living arrangements. Still, for all the church's fire and brimstone, many communities adopted a don't ask don't tell attitude. As long as you didn't challenge public norms too loudly, life often carried on. There was, after all, no shortage of real problems to deal with: crop failure, feudal wars, and figuring out whether this week's bread had rye or hallucinogenic mold. The boundaries of desire. Desire in the Middle Ages didn't fit clean boxes. While the Church loved a clean dichotomy, holy versus sinful, man versus woman, heaven versus earthly temptations, real human relationships were far messier. Bisexuality, gender nonconformity, and same-sex attraction existed then as they do now, even if they didn't have modern labels. Some court records, particularly from urban centers, show cases involving people dressing in clothes of the wrong gender, or being accused of unnatural affections. Punishments ranged from penance to public humiliation, depending on the era and the local temperament. But just as often, these individuals disappear quietly from the record, not because they stopped existing, but because the scribes simply stopped writing. Love in the margins. Not all medieval love stories made it into official chronicles. Most didn't. The great romances of the period, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, were written for entertainment, morality lessons, or political allegory, not as guides to real-life romance. Real love stories were scribbled into the margins of books. Whispered in candlelit kitchens, or hidden in stained glass initials depicting two figures a little too close together for, just friends. Even when society forbade it. People loved each other across boundaries of class, religion, gender, and expectation. A peasant girl might fall for a traveling bard. A merchant's son might write poems to another apprentice in the next guild hall over. Some of these stories ended in scandal. Others in quiet compromise. And a few, miraculously, simply endured. Closing the curtains on the Middle Ages, and maybe not the only thing. So what can we take away from all this? The Middle Ages were not a monolithic age of prudery, darkness, and repression. They were contradictory, layered, and human. Yes, the Church wielded enormous influence. Yes, there were rules, restrictions, and judgmental friars lurking around every stone corner. But amid all that, people still managed to love, desire, mess up, forgive, and try again. They flirted, despite the mud. They kissed, despite the lack of minty breath. They made promises under candlelight, despite the local geese honking in protest. And they left behind a world that, if you look closely, wasn't so different from ours after all. A world where intimacy was both sacred and scandalous. Where love was a risk, a ritual, and sometimes a rebellion. Coming up next, maybe we explore what counted as fashionable in the 13th century. Why everyone was obsessed with relics, or how to host a medieval dinner party without offending half the village. Until then, keep your curiosity alive, your tunic straight, and your nose clear of any questionable stews. Some historians debate whether certain medieval relationships were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But one thing's clear. Feelings were involved, often expressed in poetry, secrecy, and allegory. The modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist back then. People didn't come out, they lived quietly, often coded. And always carefully. There were no pride parades, but there were saints, songs, stories, and intense pilgrimages made suspiciously in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was risky business, like juggling knives while handling a live chicken. It was loud, messy, and likely to end with someone losing pride, property, or both. It wasn't just seen as a moral failing, it was a social offense. Marriage wasn't only a holy sacrament but also a contract, a financial agreement, and often a strategic alliance. So, cheating didn't just break hearts, it disrupted inheritances, dowries, and the delicate balance of village gossip. For women, the stakes were much higher. A married woman caught in an affair might face public humiliation, lose her dowry rights, be forced into penance, or even exiled, especially if there was proof. Noblewomen could be imprisoned, divorced, or quietly removed from court. Think less scarlet letter and more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, often got away with more. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be frowned upon but rarely punished, unless the woman's family was influential or the church was feeling especially zealous. Still, not all adulterers escaped unscathed. Some towns imposed fines or demanded public confessions. In a few cases, offenders had to parade through town in just a shift or fund a new church bell, because nothing says repentance like buying acoustics for God. Yet the biggest danger wasn't always the law. It was the husband. Among nobles, honor killings were not uncommon. A wronged man might be allowed by custom to take matters into his own hands. And how far he could go depended largely on his title and how many swords he owned. Among the wealthy, infidelity could spark scandals, annulments, or decade-long family feuds. Among peasants, the fallout was more practical, a fine, a goat, and permanent infamy in village gossip. Consent in medieval Europe existed, but not in the way we think of it today. It was entangled in laws, dowries, church rules, and social expectations. Canon law did recognize that mutual verbal consent was enough to make a marriage valid, even without a priest. So technically, two people saying, "I will," in a field could be married. Romantic? Yes. Legally confusing? Absolutely. But theory wasn't always practice, especially for women. Noble daughters had their matches arranged like diplomatic treaties. A polite nod might be requested from the bride-to-be, but in truth, the dowry spoke louder. Peasant women had more choices, but still faced pressure. Saying no could mean social backlash, or worse, if you turned down someone powerful. Inside marriage, consent was even murkier. A husband had legal access to his wife's body, and refusal could be grounds for complaint or annulment. The marital debt, as some theologians called it, was a spiritual obligation, less about love and more about duty. Yet the picture wasn't entirely bleak. Courts did sometimes prosecute cases of coercion or assault, especially when witnesses were available or the accused lacked social clout. In cities like London and Paris, legal records show both men and women pursuing justice, or at least making enough noise to be noticed. Medieval literature also reveals a world where love and consent were central themes. Courtly love poems feature knights yearning, ladies denying, and lots of dramatic fainting. At the very least, people knew consent mattered, even if they often ignored the answer. The church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure. Not just complicated, deeply suspicious. Sex within marriage wasn't banned, but it was heavily regulated. Moderation was the rule, dim lighting, no enjoyment, once a month if necessary. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were encouraged to abstain, especially if they were older, pious, or simply fed up with each other. Some went further. St. Jerome famously claimed that even desire within marriage was a weakness. Marital sex was acceptable only for reproduction, not for fun or connection. Priests were even told to ask if couples had been too lustful, yes, even with their own spouse. Imagine the silence in those confessionals. Still, people lived their lives. Peasants, merchants, and nobles alike often nodded politely at church teachings and then ignored them. After a long day working fields or managing a manor, a little affection was more comforting than sinful. For the especially devout, celibate marriages were celebrated. These couples lived and prayed together, seeing physical abstinence as a holy virtue, if not a practical one. So, with all this, arranged marriages, public punishments, verbal birth control, and bath-related suspicions, did people still fall in love? Absolutely. Awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Peasants courted in fields, whispering sweet nothings over turnips. Nobles exchanged secret glances and verses during banquets while pretending to care about hawking. Monks and nuns wrote letters so full of longing that scholars still debate their true intent. Medieval stories are brimming with romance. Troubadours sang of unreachable ladies and noble suffering. Courtly love was all about yearning, usually for someone off-limits. But longing makes the best lyrics. Some couples truly did marry for love. Records show peasants eloping. Nobles defying their families, and parents groaning at broken dowry deals. The church even required verbal consent from both bride and groom, though that consent might be delivered while holding a goose and side-eyeing an angry uncle. And once married, many couples formed real partnerships. They worked side by side, raised children, endured plagues, and tackled taxes together, basically the medieval version of a romantic getaway. Letters between spouses reveal genuine affection, worry, and loyalty. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than politics, choosing love in later life. Because no matter the rules, the risks, or the rituals, people wanted to be loved. Ideally before curfew. And definitely not during Lent. It wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. Marcus Aurelius believed that by anticipating hardship, he could face it with steadiness, not fear. To him, the misdeeds of others weren't personal insults, but reflections of their ignorance. His duty wasn't to control others, it was to master himself. He often reminded himself, you could die tomorrow. You could die today. So act now, not with panic, but with purpose. That wasn't despair. That was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing an empire, Marcus was deeply focused on his inner life. He believed that even in the midst of chaos, one could remain untouched, so long as the mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected luxury. And though he didn't always live up to Stoic ideals, who could? He returned to them like a sailor to a compass in a storm. Marcus didn't invent Stoicism. But in many ways, he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He showed that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in robes or ascetic monks, it was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, seeking to carry peace into the battlefield of life. But after Marcus's death in 180 CE, the flame of Stoicism began to dim. It didn't vanish, but it faded. The fade of a philosophy. The philosophy that once stood at the heart of Roman intellectual life quietly receded. Politics played a part. Marcus's son Commodus inherited the empire and seemed bent on destroying every Stoic virtue his father upheld. Where Marcus lived with wisdom and restraint, Commodus embraced vanity and excess. The Roman court became a spectacle. Philosophy had no place in the drama. At the same time, a new force was rising, Christianity. As it spread through the empire and became the state religion, its theology, rituals, and worldview began to displace the ancient schools. Stoicism preached self-reliance, Christianity emphasized divine grace. Stoicism taught acceptance of fate. Christianity offered redemption and the will of God. Though not always in conflict, many early Christian thinkers saw Stoicism as noble, but ultimately pagan. Admirable, yet incomplete. Still, Stoicism didn't disappear. Its essence quietly migrated, infusing early Christian thought. Church fathers like Augustine, though critical of Stoic pride, respected its moral rigor. Monastic traditions, especially among ascetics, borrowed from Stoic discipline, silence, simplicity, denial of luxury. And constant self-examination, practices that would feel right at home in the works of Epictetus or Seneca. During the medieval period, Stoicism became a background philosophy. Respected. Quoted. But rarely lived. No longer a street philosophy, it became a whisper in the margins, preserved by scribes, theologians, and the occasional curious mind. And yet, survival sometimes matters more than success. Because when the winds shifted, during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Stoicism was still there, ready to rise. The modern revival. After centuries underground, Stoicism bloomed again when the modern world needed it most. Its comeback wasn't heralded with scrolls or sermons, but with blogs, books, and podcasts. In the 20th century, philosopher Pierre Hadot reintroduced Stoicism as a living practice, not an abstract system. He argued that ancient philosophy was meant to be lived, a daily spiritual exercise. Stoicism, more than any school, was practical, contemplative, and healing. That message resonated. In the early 2000s, writers like Ryan Holiday made Stoicism accessible. In books like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy, Stoic wisdom became a toolkit for resilience, relevant whether you were launching a startup, coaching a team, or facing a tough Monday. Tech entrepreneurs embraced it. So did athletes, soldiers, and overwhelmed teenagers. Tim Ferriss, Naval Ravikant, and others cited Stoic texts like instruction manuals for mental clarity and emotional discipline. In a world addicted to speed, noise, and validation, Stoicism offered stillness. Even psychology caught on. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, borrows deeply from Stoic principles: challenge destructive thoughts, focus on what you can control, don't let emotion govern action. Sound familiar? Of course, the revival drew critics. Some say modern Stoicism has been watered down, reduced to motivational wallpaper for productivity brothers. There's truth to that. But the reason it survived isn't because it's trendy. It's because it works. In moments of grief, failure, or crisis, Stoicism offers a simple but powerful reminder. You can't control what happens, but you can control who you become. Stillness in a noisy world. Today, Stoicism lives in paradox. A philosophy of inner peace, thriving in a world of chaos. Scroll through social media, and you'll find Marcus Aurelius quotes sandwiched between cat videos and crypto tips. Walk into a bookstore, and there it is, the Daily Stoic. Ready to be your morning mental vitamin. But Stoicism isn't popular because it's fashionable. It's popular because it satisfies a modern hunger, the need for mental clarity in a world full of noise. When everything feels out of control, economies, relationships, algorithms, Stoicism offers a path inward. It asks timeless questions: what is in your control? What kind of person will you be? No matter what happens. Unlike some philosophies that demand withdrawal, Stoicism invites participation. Raise your kids. Serve your community. Work hard. But do it with calm. With integrity. With purpose, not panic. That's Stoicism's quiet rebellion. Not in shouting or posturing, but in restraint. In the courage to pause. In the strength to stay kind in a cruel moment. In the humility to know you're not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for how you move through it. No philosophy is perfect. Stoicism won't make you immune to grief or anger. But it gives you a framework to reset. To reflect. To begin again. Not with ego, but with grace. Bathing in the Roman world, cleanliness, culture, and control. To the modern eye, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury spa, marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and sunlit pools. But to a Roman, it was just a Tuesday. By the empire's peak, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone. From senators to shoemakers, everyone bathed. Cleanliness mattered, but so did the rhythm, the heat, the conversation, the ritual. You'd begin in the apoditerium, or changing room. Then ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your pores. Next came the caldarium, a hot, steamy chamber where you'd sweat. Scrape your skin with a curved strigil, maybe get a massage. Finally, you'd plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to shock the system. This contrast, hot to cold, tension to release, was believed to help mood, digestion, and circulation. And they were probably right. But the baths weren't just for health. They were hubs of Roman life. A place to be seen. To gossip, to debate, to negotiate. Some brought musicians. Some brought snacks. Philosophers argued beneath domed ceilings. Poets recited verses over steam and laughter. Though status still mattered. The bath was one of Rome's more democratic spaces. Emperors might bathe near commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access, but they were present, part of the rhythm of Roman society. Bathing was not vanity. It was routine. It was culture. It was being Roman. Roman engineering, genius beneath the steam. Roman baths weren't just cultural marvels. They were engineering feats. At their heart was the hypocaust, an underfloor heating system. Slaves stoked a roaring furnace beneath raised floors. Hot air flowed through this space and rose through wall flues, creating a consistent, smoke-free warmth. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat. Domes diffused sound. Windows harvested sunlight. Water flowed constantly. Thanks to the aqueducts, stone channels that delivered massive volumes of water to cities. Baths like those of Caracalla or Diocletian used millions of liters daily, yet waste was minimal. Water heated, circulated, and drained, all powered by gravity. Steam rooms, saunas, even primitive toilets, all integrated. Maintenance was ongoing. Workers known as fornicators tended furnaces. Others cleaned pools, managed supplies, repaired tiles. It was labor-intensive, but enduring. Many baths stood strong for centuries. To walk into a Roman bath wasn't to enter a building, it was to step into a living, humming system, powered by fire, sustained by water, shaped by genius. The social network of ancient Rome. Beyond the steam, Roman baths were centers of communication. Without phones, newspapers, or email, the baths served as a kind of open-air social network. News didn't trickle, it flowed. Who was sleeping with whom? What the emperor planned. What battles were lost or bribes paid. If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, you went to the baths. The elite used this strategically. The baths were public arenas. Politics didn't stop at the Senate. It soaked into the marble floors. A senator might accidentally run into a rival in the caldarium, float a proposal, or drop a threat under the cover of steam. Patrons reaffirmed loyalties. Emperors like Hadrian or Antoninus Pius bathed publicly as image control, to show they were still one of the people. Sort of. Business was discussed. Poems recited. Philosophy debated. In every way. The Roman bath wasn't just a place of cleansing, it was a stage. A whispering gallery. A ritual of rhythm, reflection, and shared humanity. But even in ruin, the Roman bathhouses never fully disappeared. Their broken columns and silent pools became monuments to a lost world, echoes of steam, laughter, and empire embedded in stone. Travelers of later centuries wandered through these remains with awe, imagining the voices that once bounced off marble walls or the warm water that once soothed tired bodies. Artists painted them. Poets lamented them. And engineers studied them. In time, their influence reawakened. The Renaissance, with its reverence for antiquity, saw architects revive the symmetrical layouts and vaulted chambers of Roman baths in new civic buildings. Scholars rediscovered ancient texts on medicine, hygiene, and architecture, and slowly, Europe remembered what Rome had long understood, that public health and public beauty could, and should, exist together. This legacy lived on in places like Bath, England, where the ancient springs were reimagined as elegant spas, or in Baden-Baden, Germany, where emperors of a new age came to soak in imperial style. The very idea of the modern wellness center, with its saunas, cold plunges, massages, and lounges, traces its lineage back to the Thermae. And in another way, the Roman bath lives on in our daily routines. The concept that health is more than just the absence of illness, that it involves physical exertion, mental clarity, communal experience, and ritual care, was Roman before it was modern. We might not scrape our skin with strigils or debate Stoic philosophy in the tepidarium, but the spirit is familiar, to sweat, to reflect, to connect, and to emerge restored. So the next time you step into a steam room, plunge into cold water, or wrap yourself in a towel after a long workout, imagine for a moment marble underfoot, mosaics above, and voices swirling through domed ceilings. You're not just recovering, you're taking part in a 2,000-year-old tradition. In ancient Egypt, medicine was more than a science, it was a sacred art, woven into the fabric of daily life, religion, and the cosmic order. Healing wasn't confined to laboratories but took place in temples, homes, and the domain of the gods. The Egyptians believed illness could arise not only from injury or infection but also from divine displeasure, malevolent spirits, or disruptions in Ma'at, the universal balance of order and justice. Physicians, known as SWNW, often worked side by side with priests and magicians, blending empirical observation with spiritual intervention. Temples like those dedicated to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and later deified healer, served as centers for both treatment and divine consultation. There, patients might sleep overnight hoping for dream-based diagnoses, a practice known as incubation. Medical training was rigorous. Students studied scrolls such as the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which compiled hundreds of cases, remedies, and procedures. These texts show a deep understanding of symptoms and treatments, from wound suturing to dental care, while also incorporating spells, charms, and ritual incantations. The Egyptians saw no contradiction in this fusion of medicine and magic. Healing the body meant healing the spirit, too. Diagnosis was rooted in observation. Physicians examined patients' appearance, posture, breath, pulse, and even bodily waste to understand internal conditions. They believed the heart was the center of a system of channels, like irrigation canals, carrying air, blood, and spirit. A weak or irregular pulse suggested a blocked channel, which could call for physical remedies, spiritual intervention, or both. Their pharmacopoeia was vast. Remedies included herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils. Honey, prized for its antibacterial qualities, was used on wounds. Garlic, onions, juniper, and myrrh were used for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties. Some treatments, like using crocodile dung or lizard blood, strike modern readers as bizarre, but they reflected a worldview where symbolic meaning was as important as physical effect. Surgical care was remarkably advanced. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, over 3,600 years old, offers clinical, step-by-step treatment for injuries like skull fractures and dislocated vertebrae. It even categorized cases as treatable, uncertain, or hopeless, an early form of triage. Egyptian surgeons used bronze tools to clean, stitch, and dress wounds, often applying antiseptic substances such as honey, beer, or resin. Though they lacked anesthesia and internal surgery, evidence from mummies shows healed fractures and surgical success. Women's health was also a major focus. The Kahan Gynecological Papyrus is the oldest known medical text dedicated entirely to women's reproductive health, addressing fertility, pregnancy, birth, and contraception. Diagnostic methods included clever experiments, like urinating on barley to predict pregnancy or even the baby's sex. Contraceptives involved natural barriers made of honey and acacia, and childbirth was attended by midwives, aided by spiritual protections like incantations and amulets of Taurit. The Hippo goddess of birth. Magic was inseparable from medicine. Illness without an obvious cause was attributed to curses, restless spirits, or divine wrath. The healer invoked Heka, the divine force of magic, through chants and rituals to activate the healing power of a remedy. Spells were embedded in medical texts, often calling on deities like Isis or Thoth for help. Amulets were worn for protection, and sacred animals or star alignments might inform a diagnosis. Perhaps the most striking example of Egypt's medical spiritual fusion was mummification, a process combining anatomical knowledge, chemical application, and religious ritual. Embalmers preserved the body for the soul's eternal journey by removing organs, drying the body with natron, and wrapping it in linen with protective amulets. They acted as both technicians and ritual specialists, ensuring the dead could meet the afterlife whole and prepared. All this medical knowledge was carefully documented on papyrus scrolls, not passed by word of mouth but preserved in text studied at houses of life, temple-based scholarly institutions. The Ebers Papyrus, stretching over 100 feet, catalogues more than 700 treatments. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like a battlefield surgeon's manual. The Kahan Papyrus reveals gynecological insight far ahead of its time. Egyptian medicine didn't disappear with the sands. It deeply influenced later Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, who praised and adopted many Egyptian methods. Their structured approach, symptom observation, classification, hygiene, and treatment protocols, foreshadowed modern medical science. Their use of garlic, aloe vera, castor oil, and willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, still resonates in modern pharmacology. But perhaps their most lasting legacy is how they saw the healer, not just as a technician, but as a guardian of both body and soul. In Egypt, to heal was to see the whole person. To ease suffering physically, emotionally, and spiritually. That deeply human approach to care, so ancient, and yet so familiar, continues to shape how we understand healing today.